Howdy, y'all. This is Tim Hansel. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some of the things in Chapter 1, which is primarily introductory material, but introduces some core concepts that are going to kind of follow along with us throughout the rest of the chapters. So it's kind of important to get those sorted out before moving on to anything else. So what we're going to do today is first just talk a little bit about what critical thinking means, what Vaughn defines it as, and then kind of move on quickly to why it may be important. So just to justify the course a little bit. But after that, we'll get into the foundational material that I just mentioned. So first of all, we need to talk a little bit about claims or the content of our beliefs, and then we're going to move on to arguments, which is the big thing from this chapter. So after that, we'll just briefly take a look at some of the exercises I assigned for the end of the week, and that will be that. Okay, to start with, we want to know a little bit about just sort of what this course is about, and it is critical thinking, and so we need to know what that is. So one of the things that I asked y'all to do when you were introducing yourselves on the discussion board was to come up with an example of something that you used to believe was true, but you now believe is false. And I asked you to do something that was sort of embarrassing, just because that's funny. But the sort of philosophical point here of that question is to kind of drive home the idea is that we are fallible when it comes to forming beliefs. So just what that means is that we could be wrong, that we could believe that something is true, and for it to turn out to not be true. And so that's a possibility that we need to contend with. And that if we want our beliefs to be true, this is kind of the hypothetical here, right? If you find yourself in a situation where you think you need your beliefs to be true, then we need to determine whether or not the evidence or the reasons that we have for our belief are justified. In fact, if we don't have any reasons for our belief, that's a bad situation. So presumably we do have a reason to think that something is true. And then sort of the further question is whether or not those beliefs are ever justified. So this gets us to sort of Vaughn's definition of critical thinking, which is the systematic evaluation or formation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. So I think what sort of Vaughn is trying to point to here is this idea that what we are going to do sort of systematically is to kind of make our reasoning process sort of as explicit as possible. We're going to go through and think about sort of what these beliefs are, and try to be explicit about sort of what we think would justify that belief, and then to move on to the evaluation stage, which is to determine what sorts of reasons actually do justify our beliefs and things. So what sorts of things count as good reasons, and what sorts of things count as sort of bad reasons or no reason at all. Okay, so that's critical thinking in sort of a nutshell. We have these beliefs. Those beliefs can be false, and we want to figure out a way to evaluate those beliefs to determine whether or not our beliefs are true. And so the goal here is true belief, right? We want to keep the beliefs that we are sort of justified in believing, and jettison the beliefs that we have no or bad evidence for. So there's this question about sort of why is this important? What is the purpose or value of such an endeavor? And Vaughn briefly talks about sort of three things, and I'll just kind of mention them here. and say a thing or two about them. So just real briefly, Vaughn, and I agree with him here, is that Vaughn thinks that critical thinking gives you skills for learning and exploring. That with critical thinking you can protect yourself from error, manipulation, and prejudice, and critical thinking aids in self-discovery. So all of this is about truth. It's good to know true things if you're going to learn something, or either about the outside world or about yourself. It's certainly important to have true beliefs if you're going to avoid error, but also sort of manipulation, right? The idea that you could be manipulated into believing something is false, or manipulating into believing something for bad reasons, or for no reasons, is an important issue here. That part of the value of critical thinking that at least I place on this material is this idea of autonomy, that you're thinking for yourself, you're forming beliefs based on evidence, and not just because somebody told you that something is true, and getting a sense of sort of what counts as good evidence and what counts as bad evidence is important for that goal. That otherwise you're just kind of out there in this sort of sea of information, and you have no way of determining what's true and what's false. Um, and and just to kind of tie this into this idea of critical thinking aiding in your sort of self-discovery, one of the tricks about critical thinking, and about being aware of error, and where you can go wrong, and thinking about things, is that when it comes to our own beliefs, we tend to be pretty blind to our mistakes, that we're actually sort of much better at noticing other people's failure to think critically, other people, especially if we have reason to disagree with them, or that they are part of a group that we don't like. Um, we are pretty keen on kind of noticing where they're believing something for no reason, or that they are believing things for sort of bad reasons. And the trick for this class, though, is to sort of turn that sort of inward. Is that we're pretty bad in sort of noticing it ourselves, and so we tend to we tend to perpetuate sort of falsehoods in our own beliefs because we're just so biased. Now, this is something that comes up a lot in Chapter 2 about these sort of biases and psychological impediments to sort of critical thinking, but we're pretty bad at it. So the more that we sort of learn about this methodology and this process, the more likely we'd be able to confront our own fallibility and our own inability to think rationally about things, and to apportion a belief according to the evidence, which is what you should do if you're a critical thinker. Um, so moving on just sort of really quickly, just to ask you a question about the value of truth, right? Is it really ever important to avoid error and to seek truth? Here's a question that I typically ask most of my students. It's kind of a personal question, but I think it's a good litmus test as to to how much you sort of value truth. So, would you rather know the truth about a significant other cheating on you, or continue living in blissful ignorance? So presumably, if you found out that a romantic partner of yours was cheating on you, that would be disappointing. That would make you feel bad. But if you would rather know the truth, despite that sort of bad feeling, that tells you a little bit about something, um, about the value that you place on truth. That at least in some circumstances, knowing the truth is important, and matching up your beliefs with the truth is a valuable goal. So insofar as that ever comes up in any sort of scenario, then this methodology is going to have value. All right, so let's move on to start talking about the sort of the core material here. So the first thing that we need to sort of think about are claims. So we talk a lot about claims or statements or propositions or declarative sentences, but we'll just sort of stick with claims. So to start with, because we're talking about belief, I just want to sort of think about, the sort of language that we use to talk about belief. So, for instance, just thinking about the things I believe right now as I'm recording this, I believe that my name is Tim. I believe that it's sunny outside. I believe that there are 2 cats in my house at the moment. And I believe that my children are outside playing with my wife. So these are all things that I believe to be true, and they all fit in this statement that I believe that P. And so a claim then is just whatever that P is. Whatever comes after I believe that is a claim. A claim is just a statement, a proposition, a declarative sentence. Um, it is, the content of your beliefs. And a statement, proposition, or declarative sentence, or whatever you want to call it, they are unlike other kinds of sentences like questions or commands or exclamations or what have you, in the fact that they have truth value. Back to one of my beliefs here that I use as an example, right? I believe that it's sunny outside. The sentence "it's sunny outside" has truth value. That it is a sentence that could be true, or it's a sentence that could be false. So for simplicity, we say that a truth value is just that a claim is either true or false. So if it is sunny outside, then that sentence is true. If it's not sunny outside, then the sentence is false. It's just sort of simple. All right. So now that we've talked about what a claim is, now we need to move on to arguments. So a claim is sort of the content of our belief, right? So I believe that it's sunny outside right now. And so it's sunny outside is a claim, it has truth value. But what I want to know is whether or not I'm justified in believing that claim, right? Am I justified in believing that it's sunny outside? So that's where we get into sort of the concept of an argument. That an argument is a way to sort of make our reasoning about something explicit. So I want to know if my belief is justified. I'm going to need to kind of identify the belief, but also sort of identify the things sort of leading up to that belief. And so an argument is going to be sort of a set of different claims, right? There's going to be the thing that is sort of up for discussion, or that the thing that we are sort of arguing about, just to use the term. And then there's going to be the things that sort of are at least intended to justify that belief. So all arguments have conclusions, that there's the thing that we're sort of arguing about, and then all arguments have at least one premise, that the premises are the things that are intended to sort of justify our belief in that thing. So we'll have an example here in just sort of a second, but just get that sort of clear, is that there's always going to be a conclusion, the things that are being argued for, and there's always going to be at least one thing, and in many cases more than one thing, but at least one thing that is supposed to sort of justify that conclusion. And just to kind of mention that, we are eventually going to talk about whether or not the arguments are good, and so just quick rule of thumb is that the good arguments will provide justification for our belief, and the bad arguments will not. And then just because it comes up sort of so often, we just have to say that a bad argument does not provide justification for the opposite of the conclusion, right? So just because you have a bad argument doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. It just means that you're not justified in believing that is true. So that's maybe sort of a subtle difference, but it's one to sort of keep in mind, that a bad argument does not mean that the conclusion is false. Okay, so here's an example of an argument. Suppose we're talking about, what day is it today? I sometimes forget what day of the week it is. And suppose somebody says that sort of today is Tuesday, or that I formed the belief that today is Tuesday for some reason, and I want to know whether or not that belief is justified. And and so I sort of search my thoughts here, and I say, okay, well, one of the reasons that I think that today is Tuesday is because yesterday was Monday, and the other reason is that my phone display shows Tuesday. That both of these things are sort of further beliefs that I have, but importantly, they are beliefs that I think that actually sort of justify my conclusion. They justify my drawing an inference from those two premises to the conclusion. And whether or not I'm right that they are justified is a question for another day. But for now, it sort of suffices to show that, yes, indeed, that is an argument. There's a conclusion, and there's a couple things that I think sort of justify my belief in that conclusion. Here's another example. It's about whether or not the Earth is round. I think it probably is, but some people disagree. But here's an example of some reasoning that somebody might go through when it comes to forming the belief that it is probably round. So the conclusion then of the argument would be that the Earth is probably round, and one premise that you might have is that the Earth is a planet. So if you believe that the Earth is a planet in our solar system, and you also sort of take note, here's this other premise, that every other planet in the solar system is round, like Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, so on and so forth, then you might sort of infer that, well, the Earth, just like every other planet, is probably round. So here's some reasoning about the shape of the Earth. It's an argument, and whether or not that suffices to justify your belief in the shape of the Earth is something that we'll discuss later. Okay, so before sort of wrapping up here a little bit, I just want to mention that one of the things that we will do, at least a little bit in this class, is deal with sort of arguments in the rough. So this is something that the author Lewis Vaughn talks a little bit about. That oftentimes we are presented with arguments from somebody else, right? Somebody else is making an argument, and it is up to us to sort of evaluate it to see whether or not it would sort of justify us in forming a belief. So the thing about sort of finding arguments is that people rarely write them out explicitly. So we'll do a lot of list making here, where we say, well, here's a premise, and here's another premise, and here's a conclusion. But very rarely, unless you're a philosopher, will you find people sort of presenting the arguments that way. So it's always a bit of a challenge in those kinds of situations, and I just wanted to mention sort of a few things about them. So one thing, very important thing to bear in mind is not everything is an argument, right? People are not always trying to convince you with evidence that something is the case. So they may be doing something else with their prose. They may be telling a story, or just relating some information, or explaining why something happened. But an argument is specifically to sort of to make a case that something is true, right? They say that, this is a thing that you should believe, and here's at least one reason that sort of backs me up. Here's one reason to think that it's true. So One of the things that helps a little bit in determining whether or not you're dealing with an argument is the use of indicator words. So in the chapter, you have words that tend to indicate conclusions, for instance. So words like therefore and so and thus and I conclude that, and so on and so forth. Those things tend to indicate that somebody is drawing a conclusion. Whereas words like because or for the reason that and since, those tend to indicate that somebody is presenting a premise, that they're giving reasons to believe that something is the case. So you should always be sort of aware that those indicator phrases and words sort of exist. Um, but they really only work if the people are sort of using the language correctly, and then even then they're not always present, right? People can sort of make arguments without the use of indicator words, right? It may be kind of confusing, but it can be done. So something to kind of think about, I just wanted to kind of mention, is the dialogue test. That this tends to be kind of how I try to sort things out in terms of whether or not I'm dealing with sort of an argument, and I use the dialogue test. So the way that the dialogue test works, I've already used it sort of a couple times in this little lecture here, is to try to make sort of a hypothetical dialogue out of sort of what you're reading. That if somebody is making an argument, then it could kind of fit in the following dialogue that I have here. So I have just a very brief sort of dialogue between sort of an author and the reader, where the author might say, and you could sort of imagine the author saying that I believe that such and such is true, right? I believe that the earth is flat. And so somebody might say, oh, and this would be you, or the reader could reply with, well, why, right? This is asking for justification, right? Why should I believe that the earth is flat? And then if the author goes ahead and provides you with something, right? It says, well, look, you look at the horizon and the horizon looks flat, right? You, well, I'm having a hard time thinking of other reasons to think that the Earth is actually flat. But whatever they come up with, right? If it is in response to why do you think that? Like, what would, if they are trying to sort of justify themselves, then you're dealing with an argument, right? And the thing that they believe is that's true is the conclusion, and the thing that they're trying to sort of back up that belief with is the premises or premise, right? Maybe there's just sort of one belief, but whatever those justifiers are the premises, and of course we would like to sort of write those out as a list. All right, so that's it for just sort of the material that I wanted to mention, and we'll probably talk more about it either in our WebEx meeting or on Blackboard. But you do have these exercise assignment, this exercise assignment that's due at the end of the week. And just wanted to sort of briefly sort of go over the directions here and talk a little bit about a couple example answers, just in case people are confused. So you've got to do exercise 1.2 through 1.6. Exercise 1.2 is pretty straightforward. You have these sentences, and you just have to determine whether or not they are claims or statements. So remember, a statement or a claim or a proposition or whatever is just something that has truth value, right? It's the kind of thing that can be true or false. And these are sort of unlike commands and questions and exclamations, which do not have truth value. So, for example, number 2 in this exercise is a command. Do not allow your emotions to distort your thinking. So, not typically understood as a statement, although it could be in some contexts sort of obliquely a statement. So maybe it could be read as you should, not allow your emotions to distort your thinking. But as written, it's a command and sort of not a statement. No truth value. But this, number 9, that I shall do my best to do my duty to God and my country, is a statement. It is has truth value. Will you or will you not do your duty to God and country? If that sentence is true, then that's a truth value, and it's possible that that sentence is also false. So that sentence has truth value. So that's all exercise 1.2 is. 1.3 and 1.4 are about sort of arguments. The only difference between 1.3 and 1.4 is that in 1.4 you have to identify premises and conclusions, and at 1.3 you just have to identify the conclusion. I'm not entirely sure why it gets separated like that, but that's the only, that's the only difference. So here's a couple from 1.3, like number 2. Again, is first of all, it's just one sentence, and secondly, that sentence is a question, right? So, do you think the upcoming election will change anything? It's not an argument, right? Nobody is stating anything, and furthermore, there's nothing backing up that statement, so there's just nothing there. But number 9 is. Number 9 is an argument. The conclusion is that Spider-Man is a better superhero than Superman, and that conclusion is being backed up by some evidence. One of those things, and these are the premises. You don't have to identify them for this exercise, but they exist. The premises are kryptonite cannot hurt him, and he doesn't have a Lois Lane around to mess things up. So both of these things are premises for the conclusion, and so it's an argument, right? There are both of these sort of needed elements. I chose this one for a reason, though. I just wanted to mention that despite the fact that this is kind of a matter of opinion, it does have truth value. It's just that the truth value is relative to some individuals thinking about the issue, right? So it doesn't have objective truth value, but it does have subjective truth value. So we'll talk a little bit more about this with chapter 2 stuff, but it does have truth value, so counts as an argument. All right, exercise 1.5 is something that you have a lot of leeway with. You can just, imagine any two premises that would justify your belief in the conclusion. And so what you're given is the conclusion. And here I'm doing number 5 here. So the conclusion in number 5 is repent. The end is near. And I guess repent is a command. But I used it in this argument is that you should repent because the end is near. So a couple things about why I should repent or why I should believe that the end is near is one is that a large comet is going to impact the Earth in 3 days, and the other is just this totally fabricated idea that people who die before repenting are 80% more likely to burn in hell. So whether or not that you could ever actually sort of reliably believe the second sort of bit, if both of these things are true, it seems to justify the whole sentence, which is repent, the end is near. So that's just what you're doing here, is just come up with any two sentences, I should say any two statements or claims that would sort of justify belief in the conclusion. A little bit less open-ended, in fact, a lot less open-ended with exercise 1.6, is sort of going the other way, right? If you're given the premises and you're being asked what conclusion you can sort of safely draw from it, unless you're, dead set on making a bad argument, there's really very little that that you can sort of pick from. So Exercise 1.6, more or less has a right answer for everything. And I did number 6, which is the two premises are if there is no God, then there is no morality. And the other premise is that there is no God. So if both of these things are actually true, then I think what would follow from those two things are that there is no morality. So this is a pretty sort of straightforward argument, and the logic of the argument, which we'll discuss more in later chapters, points to pretty much just one conclusion, that there is no morality. All right, so that's it for the exercises. You'll have to work on the rest yourself, but again, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me or to post a question on Blackboard. In fact, ideally, you with all your sort of queries is to put them up on Blackboard, just because if I can sort of answer the question sort of once, I don't have to do it any more times, right? So if the answer is already up there, then people can look at it and see it, and I don't have people asking me the same questions multiple times. All right, so that's it for now. There will be a video for sort of chapter 2 a little bit later in the week, but I think this is enough for now. So good luck.